Okay, this is for the intro lecture to the Civil War unit. This is going to give you an idea of the why. Remember, from Unit 1, there is one question that you should be asking every single time we investigate some historical event, and that is WHY. Why? And the why of today is why did the southern states leave the Union? What was their motive? What was their reason? And what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, how are we going to figure out the why? And the key to this is primary sources. Primary sources are from the words of the actual people who lived back then and what their motives were from their own mouth and their own actions, what they actually did rather than what people say they were doing, if that makes any sense. Because sometimes when we look back in history, we think of people back then and we try to give them the motives that we think they had, when what we should do is just look at what they were doing and also what they actually said when it comes to why they're doing it. So we're going to look at primary sources today, the words, the actions of the actual people back then in the South and why they left. So to do this, we're going to look at several points, five specific points, uh, dealing with the Confederacy. We're going to deal with their Constitution, what they wrote in their Constitution. It gives us an indication of why they did what they did. Two, the Declarations of Succession. We had a Declaration of Independence. When we left England, we had a Declaration of Independence. And when we wrote the Declaration of Independence and when we signed it, the people who signed that Declaration of Independence, they knew that this was their death warrant if they were ever caught. They had to die for the words on that paper, on that parchment. The men back here, their Declaration of Succession for each state, they knew that this was their death warrant if they were to get caught, if they were to lose. So they had to be willing to die for the things that they wrote down in their Declarations of Succession. Then we're going to talk about the people. People who actually were in the South, generals, presidents, vice presidents, governors, in their words to why they're fighting. So there's no ambiguity here. It's what they're saying they're fighting for. And then we're looking at their economy. And we're looking at what their economy was based on and how without certain aspects of their economy would crash. And that's probably would be an incentive for them to fight for it. And then we're also going to talk about the social hierarchy. And we talked about this earlier. Social hierarchy is kind of a ladder in society in which certain people are put on different rungs. And depending on which rung you're on, will give you more privileges or benefits or possible opportunities than other people. And we'll talk about that as well. So let's get to number one, the Constitution. The thing, the big boy, right? We have a Constitution. It has our Bill of Rights. It has the description of how our government runs. All these wonderful things, right? The succession of the Southern states led to the forming of the Confederacy, and they made their own Constitution, a document that was going to not only talk about how their people had certain rights, but how their government runs. So let's look at some differences. So one, they mention God directly in the Constitution. If you look at our Constitution, we don't mention God at all. Most people get the Declaration of Independence mixed up with the Constitution. Even the Declaration of Independence doesn't directly say God. But they directly say God because they were a religious people and they wanted to invoke a religious context within their document. Other differences start showing you the motive of what's going on here. The motive of the South and why they would leave. Let's look at the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is for us 10 amendments that protect our rights. They protect our rights individually. Sorry, my child just woke up. Hi, baby. They protect our individual rights. We have the right to freedom of speech. We have the right to bear arms. We have the right to no unlawful search and seizure. All these wonderful things that we take advantage of every day that we might not realize. Well, they had a Bill of Rights too. 10 rights that they saw were super important, just like we did. Now look at our first two. Our first one is freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, petition. That's our first one, okay? And we saw them as important because those were the things being restricted by the British government at the time. We also saw the Second Amendment right as important too because we wanted to defend our right to life and liberty and pursuit of happiness, all those things in the Declaration of Independence. So we have our first two are vitally important to what's going on at the time. in what we wanted to keep after we got our independence and kept our independence from Britain. So let's look at their first two. The first two amendments to their Constitution, the first two Bill of Rights that they put down, the ones that they found most valuable, were not freedom of speech or the right to bear arms. So what did they view as important then? Their first two amendments dealt with slavery, the protection of the institution of slavery, and how slavery would not be abolished within their country. So their rights that were most important to them, according to their Constitution, according to what they wrote, according to what they were willing to fight and die for, the top two, the only two that they changed, by the way, of the 10 Bill of Rights that we had originally, the only two that they changed, the only two that they added, and they added it in the beginning, was to protect the institution of slavery. That is a government doctrine that governs the entire Confederacy and was meant to do so for their entirety of their existence if they would have lasted longer than the Civil War, which they didn't, obviously. So that gives us one indication of why they wanted to become their own nation, and one indication why they decided to fight a war for succession, for their own government, for their own country, was for slavery, because it's the first two Bill of Rights. Ours was freedom of speech and religion and other things, and theirs is protect slavery. Let's go further than that, because you got the Constitution. What about the Declaration of Succession? Remember those things that we did when we declared independence from England? Each state also had a Declaration of Succession away from the United States. A declaration that they had to be willing to die for, because this would be an act of treason to leave their country. So let's go. Texas. The servitude, this is in their Declaration of Succession. And I'm summing these up. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's like the entire thing in class. But I'm not going to do that now just for time. But this is Texas. The servitude of the African American, except they used a different word for African American, to the white man should exist for all future time. They said in their Declaration of Succession, Texas, the reason why they're leaving, one of the reasons why, and by the way, it's a prominent one. It's not like one hidden at the bottom. A prominent reason why they're leaving is to make sure that African Americans serve white men in slavery. That was one of the reasons why they left. Their words. Not to be misconstrued by what you think they thought. This is what they thought because they wrote it down in their government doctrine. Georgia, they went on a litany. That's a long discussion about how they need to protect their property. Property is a very code word here. Slaves, to protect their slaves. So their reason for leaving is to protect slavery. And their Declaration of Succession. Their words, primary sources from them, can't be misconstrued. That's what they were leaving for. Mississippi, they said a blow to slavery, this is in their Declaration of Succession, a blow to slavery would be a blow to civilization. To get rid of slavery would destroy civilization, society as we know it. This was their beliefs, written down in a government document. South Carolina also went on about protecting their property. Louisiana said that we need to preserve African slavery. In Alabama, protect the institution of slavery. These are just a few, and I'm not going to read them all right now, but these are just showing you that the governments back then, the people back then that were part of the succession of the southern states, they're outlining what they believe pretty bluntly. And that is we're leaving because we're protecting the institution of slavery. They're in the documents. They're what they said back then. You can't really go any way around that. Let's keep going, though, because that's just 2 of the 5. Let's talk about the people. The people who were in control back then. Let's talk about Vice President of the Confederacy. I apologize. The Vice President of the Confederacy said that slavery was the cornerstone of their society in the South. If you guys already know what a cornerstone is, when you build a house, it is a foundational piece of the house. It literally, everything gets built from that. Without it, the house crumbles. So, but him labeling this the cornerstone is saying without slavery, his house will crumble. And the house being the Confederacy of the United States. Or Confederacy of the South. Let's go to the president of the Confederacy, a person who owned over 100 slaves, who had invested interest to keep those slaves, also saw the African slaves as inferior. Matter of fact, we're going to go through in class the governors of these states, and multiple governors consistently say in their speeches and in the documents of their state that they see African Americans as inferior and deserving of servitude under the control of the people in the South. Generals. General Lee owned slaves. And we'll talk about Lee a lot because he's a general worth talking about from the Southern side. We also had generals like Stonewall Jackson, who has had quotes about slavery being something that he believes in. We also have one from the guy who's the massacre of Fort Pillow, who we'll talk about a lot because there were statues put up in his place. He put down this: if we ain't fighting for slavery, then what are we fighting for? This is a general saying that if we're not fighting for slavery, then what are we fighting for? And he's one of many that have this belief. And also the soldiers who wrote back at home had similar sentiment and beliefs, and we know this from primary sources. This isn't like a mystery. It's kind of like right in front of your face. The economy. So we look at the economy back then and see what their motive was as well for leaving the Union. And this is pretty basic. There's about 22 million people in the North. There's about 10 million people in the South. Almost half of those 10 million in the South were slaves. 4 million plus were slaves in the South. Almost half of the people living in the South were slaves. So how does this factor in the reason for leaving? Is because their economy was based on that slave labor. How do we know this? 75% of all cotton in the world, not in the United States, 75% of all cotton in the world came from the South. That cotton was produced based on free labor in the form of slavery. You take slavery away from them, their economy crashes overnight because that is the backbone of their economy. Tobacco was another thing that was produced in the South by 225 million pounds of tobacco was produced in the South. And this was produced on the backs of free labor in the form of African slavery. You have sugarcane was produced on the backs of African slavery. And you have rice. All of the rice in the United States produced at the time was produced in the South and was produced on the backs of free labor in the form of African slavery. You take African slavery out of this, economy of the South crashes, which means there's an invested interest to keep it, which we've already seen through the primary sources I just talked about. And again, we're going to read these in class. This is going to be, I'm going to give them to you. So we're going to talk about it. And then social hierarchy. We talked about this before. There are positions in the social ladder in the South, and in the North too. There's, and this is in many societies. It's not just what was going on in the 1800s in America. And in the South, you had the highest one would be land-owning people, and the lowest would be slaves. And there is a lot of rungs in between. So even the people that didn't own slaves had an invested interest to keep it in the South, because even if they didn't own slaves, they would still be considered higher than on the social ladder, which means they have more perks, they have more advantages, and they would get more wealth, generally speaking. Not generally speaking, just speaking, than somebody that was in servitude. With all this said, we're going to talk about tomorrow, after we go through this lecture class on Tuesday, the myth of the lost cause. And that is basically the groups of people that are promoting and have been promoting since the end of the Civil War. This has been going on since the end of the Civil War, that there was this other reason for leaving the Union, which was states' rights. But according to their own words, according to those own states in the country itself and the people running it, states' rights to do what? And they say it. They said it over and over again, the states' rights to own slaves. We'll talk about how schools in the South for many years, decades, centuries, and over a century in some cases, did not even write about slavery as an impact in the Civil War. Matter of fact, in 2019 was when Texas actually changed their textbooks to include slavery as a reason for the Civil War. 2019, you guys were like in 5th grade. So we're going to keep this in context throughout these next few days. We talk about the lost cause myth. And understand asking why is an important principle, because if we don't understand why something happened, or if we believe something that isn't true, it affects how we see the past. And we're not going to do that. We're going to see the past as it was and then discuss what we should take from it in today's context. All right. Tomorrow we jump into Lost Cause, and then we're going to get into the Civil War right after that, because we'll get the whole why down of the Civil War, and then we can talk about the what of the Civil War, and then we'll be on to the next unit.